Many ships were lost during the Second World War. The exact number is unknown, but it's estimated that between 3,500 and 4,000 vessels went down during the war, whether warships, merchant ships, or fishing trawlers. Most of them can be accounted for, since they were usually sunk by enemy munitions, including torpedoes, depth charges, and sea mines, among other types. But there were a handful that disappeared under mysterious circumstances, including a few U-boats. There were also 2 cargo ships that disappeared during World War II without a trace, both of which had formerly been in active service for the United States Navy. They were sister ships that disappeared within weeks of each and on the almost exact same route in the Caribbean Sea. To this day, it is still unknown what happened to these 2 sister ships. Their names were the USS Proteus and USS Nereus. By remarkable coincidence, they are both linked to another cargo ship, the USS Cyclops, which disappeared in World War I, and which remains the largest ship in active military service to disappear. Let's find out more about these ships and how they suddenly disappeared off the face of the Earth. The USS Proteus, designated as AC-9, was an American collier, meaning she was specifically built for the transportation of coal. She was laid down on October 31, 1911, by the Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company in Newport News, Virginia. Coincidentally, today it's the only shipyard that builds aircraft carriers in the United States. Back to the USS Proteus. She was finally launched on September 14, 1912. She was the lead ship of her class that comprised just 4 colliers, including the USS Nereus and USS Cyclops. Like many cargo ships at the time, she was eventually commissioned on July 9, 1913, to the United States Navy. Her first of 4 runs to Veracruz, Mexico, commenced on November 11, 1913. In order to deliver coal to battleships and cruisers belonging to the U.S. Navy's Atlantic Fleet off the Caribbean coast of eastern Mexico. She followed this in 1914 with various delivery runs of coal, oil, and other supplies, as well as transportation of sailors to destinations such as Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, Montevideo, Uruguay, and the Philippines. USS Proteus was assigned to the Naval Overseas Transport Service, for which she operated delivery services between Norfolk, Boston, and New York City for nearly 4 years, by which time the United States had entered the First World War. She would continue service during the last months of the war by delivering coal to places like Brest in France and Cardiff, and Barry in Wales. Post-war, and into the early 1920s, she would continue to service ships of the U.S. Navy fleet in the Caribbean Sea, crossing the Panama Canal on 4 occasions and delivering fuel and supplies to Pearl Harbor in Hawaii and Callao, Peru. However, she was decommissioned from the U.S. Navy at Norfolk, Virginia on March 25, 1924, and would remain mostly inactive for many years. Her name would finally be struck from the Naval Vessel Register on December 9, 1940. She would be sold to Saguenay Terminals Limited of Montreal, Canada on March 8, 1941, after which she operated in the Canadian Merchant Navy. The final voyage of the USS Proteus would commence in St. Thomas, in the U.S. Virgin Islands, with a full cargo of bauxite ore on board. She disappeared on November 23, 1941. With 58 souls on board, a mere 6 weeks after the United States had entered World War II. The USS Nereus, just like her sister, the USS Proteus, was also built by the Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company in Newport News, Virginia, where she was laid down on December 4, 1911. She was finally launched on April 26, 1913, and commissioned to the United States Navy less than 5 months later on September 10, 1913. Like her sister ship, USS Nereus was built as a collier, although she too would transport other fuel and supplies as well as men during her commission. After the First World War, she was detached from the Naval Overseas Transportation Service, during which time she served as a supply ship with the U.S. Navy's Atlantic Fleet. The USS Nereus was decommissioned by the U.S. Navy at Norfolk on the 30th of June 1922, nearly 2 years before the USS Proteus was similarly decommissioned. Just like her sister ship, the Nereus remained inactive for many years, being finally struck from the Navy list on December 5, 1940. She too would be sold to a Canadian company and become a part of the Canadian Merchant Navy, except her new owner was the Aluminium Company of Canada, with her sale sealed on February 27, 1941. The Aluminium Company of Canada, based in Kingston, Ontario, was purpose-built in 1940 to assist with the Allied war effort. Canada joined the war when it declared war on Germany on September 10, 1939, more than 2 years before the United States. For her part, the USS Nereus would have Montreal as her base, from which she mostly supplied bauxite ore to aluminum plants in the United States and Canada. Nereus would disappear 2 weeks after Proteus, having vanished without a trace sometime after December 10, 1941. She had also left St. Thomas in the U.S. Virgin Islands and was transporting bauxite ore to be used to produce aluminum for Allied aircraft. Initially, there were reports that she'd been torpedoed by a German U-boat. Although U-boats were typically very active in that part of the Atlantic Ocean, no U-boat ever claimed to have sunk the USS Nereus. Furthermore, just like USS Proteus, when it disappeared 2 weeks earlier, as well as the USS Cyclops, when it disappeared in 1918, no wreckage of the USS Nereus was ever found, nor actual cause of her disappearance ever determined. And, just like her two sister ships, no final radio messages or SOS was ever transmitted from the USS Nereus. Nothing. As stated earlier in this video, the Proteus class was a group of 4 colliers that had been specifically ordered by the U.S. Navy. These were large ships at 542 feet or 165 meters in length that could accommodate an average of 240 sailors, although the USS Cyclops had 306 men on board when she disappeared in 1918. These 4 ships had an unusual design feature, in that they had a metal framework superstructure running along the entire middle of the ship. This was designed to make loading and unloading cargo quicker and more efficient. However, this tended to make the ships very middle-heavy, which was why any incorrect loading of cargo, especially heavy ore, could be hazardous. This unique design for a cargo ship, which some saw as a critical flaw in the Proteus class, could be especially dangerous in the event of, say, a freak wave or storm at sea. Something very telling was observed in 1932 on a similar collier, the USS Jason. It too had what are called structural I-beams running the length of the ship. These were directly exposed to whatever cargo was in the hold, and it was revealed that the I-beams on the USS Jason had completely rusted away. This was deemed a result of transporting caustic cargo. Well, all 3 of the USS Proteus, USS Nereus, and USS Cyclops had transported caustic ores on numerous occasions. In the case of the Nereus and Proteus, their last voyages were both laden with bauxite ore, while Cyclops was heavy with manganese ore when it disappeared on its trip from Brazil to the United States. All 3 ships had suffered from particularly heavy rolling in rough seas, and it's worth remembering that the Proteus and Nereus were already quite old ships by the time they disappeared in late 1941. Ships almost 30 years old with an inherent structural flaw could be vulnerable to rusting beams. There is therefore a very strong chance that those 3 ships all had I-beams in them that had rusted away, leaving them highly vulnerable to being compromised under extreme conditions. That was certainly the opinion of American Admiral Van Deurs, who had served on the USS Jason. He believed that the beams on the Proteus-class ships had rusted away, making them very vulnerable to suddenly snapping, even in moderate conditions. By analogy, corroded beams and allied structural defects have certainly been identified as the cause of multiple incidents in aviation. Corroded beams were found to be the culprit in multiple wing failures on the Lockheed Electra, as well as cargo door failures on McDonnell Douglas DC-10s. The fact that 3 of the 4 Proteus-class ships sank, apparently very suddenly and without a trace, does heavily suggest a structural flaw with them. Furthermore, the USS Jupiter, as the other and sole survivor of the 4 Proteus-class vessels, would have been heavily refurbished when converted into an aircraft carrier. That would have surely nullified the innate structural defect that the other 3 colliers had before they disappeared. However, there was one important detail about all 3 of the Proteus colliers that disappeared without a trace. They all did so in the same stretch of the Caribbean Sea. It's a region of the Atlantic Ocean that has become synonymous with maritime and aviation mysteries and conspiracy theories that will not quit. The area in question is the legendary and infamous Bermuda Triangle. Before you think we're going to go off on a loop about UFOs and the lost city of Atlantis and other such fantastical theories about the Bermuda Triangle, remember this one thing. Not one, but three very large ships in the form of the USS Proteus, USS Nereus, and 20-odd years before, in an earlier world war, the USS Cyclops, all disappeared. These were not tugboats or insignificant sailboats. They were large, sturdy vessels, and they all vanished without a trace in the so-called Bermuda Triangle. That location could actually explain everything. You see, it's the geography and geology of the Bermuda Triangle that is key. The Caribbean Sea and Gulf of Mexico are shallow compared to the North Atlantic Ocean that borders them. That means there is a drastic change in elevation in the ocean floor levels between these two zones. A drastic change in ocean floor level guarantees one thing: very fast-flowing currents as water picks up speed, as they are literally sucked into deeper trenches. In fact, some of the fastest-flowing currents on Earth are found in the trenches that comprise the Bermuda Triangle, and the Puerto Rico Trench in particular, which borders the one tip of the triangle. What you essentially have are the deep water equivalents of underwater rivers and, yes, waterfalls. So the Puerto Rico Trench, which is the deepest trench in the Atlantic Ocean, literally has waterfalls of fast-flowing deep water gushing into it. Experts now believe that it is the immense suctioning power of these deep water rivers and waterfalls that might literally suck vessels into them under certain conditions. This is fluid dynamics at its most fascinating. That would explain how flat-bottomed, heavy-loaded, and possibly structurally compromised ships like the Proteus-class colliers could disappear in the middle of the ocean. Importantly, the downward pulling pressure of the currents would pick up more and more strength the closer any of them got to the Puerto Rico Trench. We cannot know for sure, of course, until one or all three of the Proteus-class ships are found. An interesting side note is that the fourth of the Proteus class, the USS Jupiter, was converted into America's first aircraft carrier in 1920 and renamed the USS Langley. Unfortunately, she was attacked on February 27, 1942, by 9 twin-engine Japanese bombers to the south of the island of Java in Indonesia. She was so badly bombarded that a decision was made to scuttle her to ensure she didn't fall into enemy hands. And so the fourth and last of the Proteus class of ships sank to the bottom of an ocean. However, unlike the USS Jupiter, whose fate is well known, we still do not know to this day why and how the USS Proteus and USS Nereus, not to mention USS Cyclops, disappeared without a trace.